Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series, today we present Are You as Woke as You Think? It's Complicated. Joining us today for our conversation is Trisha Daho and Mary Ellen Giffords. Trisha Daho graduated from Miami in 1993 with a BS in economics and went on to earn her law degree from Case Western Reserve University. She spent most of her career leading large, diverse teams toward the delivery of value for her clients at a Big Four accounting and advisory firm. After making partner, Trisha was charged with building thriving practices from scratch in 4 different regions of the country, where she cultivated leaders who have gone on to become partners, CFOs, CEOs, and much more. In a giant leap into entrepreneurialism, she created Empowered, where she partners with firms on strategy transformation and diversity and inclusion. She works to create platforms for success for women and diverse people who are entering leadership positions through a diversity, inclusion, peer advisory experience focused on strategy, high-performing teams, and advocacy and leadership. Trisha regularly writes and speaks on a variety of topics, including authenticity in leadership, high-impact teams, creating growth cultures, and diversity inclusion. Also joining us to interview Trisha is Mary Ellen Giffords, who is a financial services digital transformation executive. She graduated from Miami with a BS in systems analysis and went on to get an MBA in finance and strategy from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management and an MA in counseling psychology from the University of Santa Monica. Mary Ellen has spent half of her career in technology and the other half in process re-engineering, change management, and operations leadership roles. With this diverse experience, she is able to bridge technical and non-technical people and lead them to solve complex problems and deliver results. Mary Ellen is also an active member of the College of Engineering and Computing's Women Advisory Council, who have joined us in this presentation today, and is the founder and co-lead of the Alumni Student Mentoring Program. Welcome to Trisha and Mary Ellen. Thank you for joining us today. And just a note for our viewers, questions were collected during registration and our panelists will address some of those throughout the webinar today. You'll also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. Please note that in the interest of time we have available, we may not get to every question. Today's webinar will last about an hour, including time for those questions and answers. And with that, I will turn it over to Mary Ellen and Trisha to get us started. Welcome.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.
Trisha, it's good to see you. It's Trisha and I are friends in Chicago, and it's good to see her in this larger group today. So thank you all for coming. So let's get started with the question. So as Molly mentioned, you are a partner in a Big Four accounting firm. And many people would have thought you would reach the top of your career in that field, but you decided to go for a new summit and go into entrepreneurship. And what made you take that leap from partner to being an entrepreneur?
So I was having a really good time at EY. So I had an amazing career there. I had a lot of opportunity really early in my career, and I was getting to do, new and exciting things every day, which is what excites me. And then I got to the Chicago office back in 2010, and the culture was just drastically different than I was ready for. Started to feel excluded way more than I did in any of my prior places, and decided, a couple things happened. I met my husband in France on a vacation, and he was asking me really important questions I'd never asked myself, like, do you love working 80 hours a week? I was like, but I came to the conclusion that I could have more impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion as a third party coming into companies than I could as a partner in my own firm. And that was kind of the final decision making for me.
So you started your firm focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I can see the parallel from being a partner at a Big Four firm to strategy transformation. But what's the link between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how did you become a leader and an expert in this area?
Well, I started the work about 20 years ago at EY, leading their initiatives around gender equity in particular, and then diversity, equity, inclusion generally, in all the different regions of the country that I worked. So that is where it started. I decided it was going to be the main thrust of what we do as a company, because there is still so much work to do, even in large, giant places with tons of resources available to them. And I knew that the strategy piece of it, the business strategy piece of it, would only act to augment and amplify what we do on the DEI side. And that's why, to me, they're very much synergistic, because people and culture drive everything else that happens in business strategy.
So you said you've been doing this work for over 20 years. How have you seen it evolve in that time? How have you seen it not evolve? And where would you like to see it evolve to in 20 years?
Well, that is a question that we could spend 3 hours answering, but I'll do my best. So most larger companies are often in awareness building phase. So I see them as 4 different phases. The first phase is assessment, what I call assessment, which isn't very sexy, but incredibly important to the work, because it tells you what you don't know. And I promise you don't already know what you think you know. So it's a combination of, cultural surveys and that have DEI questions in them, and reviewing your data around the employee life cycle, so you know if there are inequities happening, even if you never intended them to happen. And then you move on to what I call awareness building phase, which is where most people stop, which is unconscious bias sessions and anti-racism sessions and gender bias sessions and learning sessions and listening sessions and other education. Those are powerful and important, but they don't get to strategy, real strategy and implementation. How do we change what we know exists within our organization and within our own control? So a lot of larger companies have moved into strategy building. They haven't quite gotten to measurement, which is my 4th phase. How do we determine that we're actually moving the ball, and faster than, moving a couple of percentage points in 20 years, which is what I've experienced personally? And how do we tweak our strategies and then filter that strategy down to personal accountability in a meaningful way, so that change actually starts to happen organically? And I have not seen, frankly, any firms that have exacted that process. This is a long journey, and you have to be willing to dig in and make it a long journey. But the middle market, because of the murder of George Floyd last May, has kind of woken up to all of it. And so they're moving from, virtually nothing to awareness building, assessment, sometimes happening hand in hand, and hopefully moving into strategy at some point too. So, it's kind of important to realize that everyone is on a different place on this continuum, but we have a long way to go no matter what organization you're in.
So you mentioned that with the death of George Floyd last year, that more companies are becoming aware that there's a problem, and not just George Floyd's death, obviously the other deaths that have occurred. I know for me personally, I became more aware of how much there is systemic racism in our country. I think that I was a bit ignorant, I have to admit, to some of what's there systemically. How do you see companies doing something about this and waking up to this problem, as well as more people waking up to this? And how do you see them waking up, and what are they doing about it?
Well, again, that's all across the continuum too. I mean, are there other companies that are doing an anti-racism session, putting out a Black Lives Matter statement, and then doing nothing else? Yeah, there are certainly those companies. Or doing other performative things that look great in the public eye, but not really doing their own work inside. Absolutely. But then there are a lot of companies that are really trying to understand what they didn't understand a year ago, and requiring their own people to understand it at a much deeper level, and bringing the right voices to that table to make decisions about what happens next. So again, it's all over the place. I think jumping into changing things before you understand what the real deal is a big mistake I see happening. So it's important that you're doing a combination of all these things on some level of intensity before you get to a point where you feel like you're actually starting to accomplish things. But hopefully that answers the question. It's a little all over the place, but there are companies that are certainly just performative, and we're not usually engaged with those kinds of companies, but they are out there, and there's a whole fleet of people jumping into the DEI marketing space too right now. But the people doing the real work are really attempting to dig in and understand better for themselves so they can then start to effectuate what happens in their companies.
Do you see any best practices out there that are really working?
Ooh. I would have to say some of the most encouraging things to me are when leaders are vulnerable enough to say they don't fully understand and they don't fully know what to do next. And they engage their teams in meaningful ways, their diverse teams in meaningful ways, to figure it out and to apprise themselves of what's really going on for people. Those are the best strategies, frankly. I can come in and tell people all kinds of things about what I see, but until they understand, they're biologically not wired to fully understand other people's experiences. And so they have to make a big effort to be self-reflective, drop any ego in that process, and listen to people that are in those experiences every day. If that happens, I believe almost anything is possible. But those are the ones to me that start best practices, because they're engaging diverse voices in determining what happens next, combined with experience, obviously, and leadership ability.
So there's some hope.
There's always hope.
So I know that, first of all, I want to apologize. My cat just woke up and decided to make noise. So I'm trying to keep her quiet. Talking about race can be really uncomfortable. Conversations can be fraught with landmines, as certain words that might have meant something at one point now mean something different or mean different things to different people. How do people and companies overcome this so we can have productive conversations about race and fixing this problem in our society?
Well, I guess rule number one, don't avoid the conversations, because that doesn't make anything better. We've been doing that for a long time and it didn't work out so well. So I know it sounds incredibly cliche, but you need to kind of get used to feeling a little uncomfortable for a while. It's going to take a while, because you're learning things about what other people experience that could be at your hand, frankly, unknowingly. And that is bound to be uncomfortable. But it's like any other muscle. Once you start using it in a good way, it gets bigger and better and stronger. Some of the most uncomfortable conversations I have had have been because you're exposing my ignorance to me. That's obviously going to be uncomfortable. But if I want to make things better, I have to be willing to face my own ignorance and move on from it. Like, we're not going to dwell in my own ignorance for a long time. We're going to understand it's there and change the fact that it's ignorance. So you don't get to be that uncomfortable for very long once you've acknowledged what's really going on for other people. The other thing is, and I say this at almost every session that I'm running, intention does not equal impact. Like, 99% of people are not intentionally doing anything wrong. But we also have to understand that our impact by continuing systems that harm other people is serious and is happening whether we intended it or not. So you kind of just have to disarm yourself of the idea that if I didn't intend anything bad to happen, then I don't want to talk about what happened because it doesn't have anything to do with me. That's just not the case. It's not true.
So for the people here in the audience that are listening today and have the desire to do something, what do you recommend they do in their own lives? Maybe they can't control their companies, but in their own lives to help make a difference with this problem?
Yeah, well, the first thing is there's a ton of resources. So there are literally, I don't know, I think we have over 200 resources on our reading list and video list and stuff. You can also, one of the most basic things you can do is get out of the bubble you're living in, and we all live in them, and go engage with people that you don't understand and you've made assumptions about, which, by the way, is pretty much everyone that doesn't look like you. So let me give an example. My husband is Muslim, and I wanted to understand his beliefs and, frankly, some of the culture around his beliefs that I didn't have access to. I grew up in a pretty much basically a neighborhood of all Italian immigrants that were very much Roman Catholic, and I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I didn't have that exposure. When I met him, I didn't know much about Islam at all. And talking to Muslims, like actual Muslims, and now I have a vast, community of people that I'm friends with, opened my eyes to the narrative versus the reality, I guess. And there's a narrative around every underrepresented group of people that we have to challenge. And one of the best ways to challenge, and I'm not the first one to say this. I mean, there's a famous author named John Esposito that writes books about this, about Islam. The more you do that, and you disarm yourself of the assumptions you had, and if you approach those things with an open heart and an open mind, amazing things happen. But you have to be willing to get out of your bubble. Don't invite the same people to lunch every day. Don't go to the same places with the same groups of people every day. Seek out interfaith or interracial or whatever organizations where this is actually the crux of the organization. The more we do that, the better off we can be as advocates ultimately and allies to underrepresented people that are trying to get where they need to go in the world.
I like that. Don't be afraid and get out and talk to people. I was watching something on the news this morning, and they were talking about how we've gotten so particular about certain words being said or certain, assumptions get made. And they were saying that what happened to forgiveness? What happened to extending people grace and letting them make mistakes and not jumping on them? And I think that's important too as we go down these paths. So with that, I want to talk about unconscious bias. It's hard to combat because it's unconscious. We don't know about it. People aren't aware that they have it. They say, I'm not a racist, but then they don't necessarily look and see where they have those assumptions and those unconscious biases. How do you help uncover and work with your own biases as you go about your day so that you are more aware of them and you can help people uncover theirs?
Well, I think I love unconscious bias. That's like one of my favorite topics. When I just made partner at EY, I was exposed to the woman who wrote the implicit bias test and all the language around it from Harvard at one of our big partner forums. And it was a light bulb for me. I was like, wow. And my biases had a lot to do with gender roles and what I was expected to do as a woman. So it was coming from inside the house. In other words, I think bias is something that is, it's biologically wired. We come into the world with biological imperatives to keep ourselves safe. And that is where unconscious bias comes from. So your job is to disrupt your own bias, to literally change the synapses in your brain that tell you that something is one thing and it's basically not true. You've created a falsehood to protect yourself biologically. It's like a mess in the system that hasn't worked out. So disrupting bias, what does that mean? For me, it means constantly checking myself on what decisions I plan to make that day, who I'm engaging with, how I intend to engage with them, and then doing the end of the day synopsis about how well I did, and if I did anything with bias that I shouldn't have, and what I'm going to do to rectify that situation. So I know that sounds incredibly anal retentive. I promise it becomes a habit at some point, but I think the only way that you can really change the way you think is to actually practice thinking differently, very intentionally over time until it becomes much more of a habit.
So in the last year, the focus of diversity and inclusion has really been about race. And I understand this because people are literally dying and we need to change systemic things are happening in our society so that people don't die for things that aren't crimes enough to die for. But there are other aspects of bias, like you mentioned, religious bias or gender bias or sexual orientation bias. Are companies focusing on those as well, or is the focus pretty much about race these days?
Oh, I would say it depends on the industry. Like there are other, industries that are focused on lots of things. The giant companies have the resources to focus on all kinds of different kinds of bias. But I would say right now it's overwhelmingly about racial bias. I do think at some point, well, it'll all be back on the table again, and we'll be, the good news is strategy and good informed strategy will apply to everyone. Like creating an inclusive culture is positive for absolutely everyone, and including white cisgendered white guys. So, the good news is the focus is racial bias because we have a turning point in our country and hopefully globally at some point that we are learning things we didn't understand fully. And we had a long way to go education-wise to get to the point where we could do effective strategy around racial bias. So it's an important and meaningful moment. And we should never downplay that. I am learning other things in conjunction with that. Like I knew very little about disability bias a couple years ago, and I'm learning way more about how that shows up in a workplace and a culture. We're also charging our team this year with developing a lot more skills around cultural intelligence, so that we can do more international work, because the issues, the stuff looks the same, but the issues are very nuanced and different regardless, depending on the country you're in. This is going to be a continuing process, but I think the racial bias question was too important for us not to make it a primary focus for as long as it is required for us to be fully educated as to what we don't know, so that we can inform how we do things.
If people want to make a difference at their companies, and their companies, they're seeing them as not addressing this or having practices that are unequal, how do you recommend they navigate that?
If they're not leaders, I guess you have to be honest with people around you. It becomes extremely personal when you are, let's say, a new staff person and you have to go into a manager and say, look, that didn't feel good to me. There were ways in which you talked to me or handled the situation that made me feel either excluded or like it was an inequitable treatment or whatever it was. Or I sense that you don't fully understand, race and how it plays out in the way we do things here. It's important, by the way, for your leaders to be helping coach you how to have those conversations. That's how you get the culture to really sing and be magical, right? My people feel comfortable coming to me and telling me that stuff. That is huge. The surveys we do, the worst answer on the questions we ask is always, do people value differing opinions here? And that variance is always the biggest in every survey we do. That is very telling every time I see it. Because if we haven't created the environment and the culture for people to be honest with us, what have we really got? Like, to me, that's a culture on very thin ice. So, your leaders and you should be having a conversation about having those conversations, frankly, so that you can be honest and vulnerable in those situations and tell people what you're really feeling and experiencing. Some of it really is just, I had no idea. I had the pleasure of meeting this amazing man who runs a company called, I completely am blanking on his company. His name is Xavier Ramey. And he and I spent a couple hours when we first met talking about racial bias. And he said, it goes down to the very granular. He does a lot of youth group work in the inner cities of Chicago, and he needs to go to 20 funerals a year because people die. And the bereavement policies in most companies don't allow for that, 20 bereavement days. But in his situation, that's required. There are ways to rise up to meet what people need and be supported in that are not going to be disruptive to what you're trying to do as a company. And when we get down to the granular is when we're really allowed to have conversations like that.
So I understand you're writing a book. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah. I am writing a book, obviously, on DEI. And it will go through some of the blocking and tackling stuff, but I am focusing on the intersection of emotional intelligence and KPIs around DEI. So what do I mean by that? I love the structure of how emotional intelligence works. Emotional intelligence is you can change it. You can make it better. It's not like IQ that you're stuck with. That's why I love it so much. So if you apply those factors, and he has got very practical ways to increase your scores. Like, everyone understands that book so well. I would love to figure out a way to make people personally accountable by matching disruption of bias against emotional intelligence factors in actual KPIs, because the strategies are great, and obviously that's what we do for a living. So we love strategy all day long. If it doesn't get all the way down into what am I doing every day to disrupt my bias and the way I make decisions, something as basic as I have this project to fill, and we're sending a traveling team out to handle a site visit. Susan just got back from maternity leave, so we won't ask her. Like, why are you not asking her? Like, that kind of stuff, really granular stuff that changes the game for people at the end of the day when it's a cumulative thing. So I really want to match strategy with personal accountability on a very deep level so we can really change the way cultures go. And that's what the book is going to be about.
Sounds exciting. Can't wait to read it. So Molly, I know that we had some questions that came in from the audience, both before they registered and during the chat here. Are there any questions that you'd like to bring in?
We do have some questions. Let's see. So I have some questions that came in during registration. And this one, I don't know if you're even going to be able to answer this, Trisha, because people don't know what they don't know. People don't know what they don't know. And sometimes it's really hard to sort of penetrate. I don't know, and I don't want to know. How do you go about educating those folks who are certainly, for lack of a better word, challenged to understand the importance of diversity and representation? Is there a certain keyword that's the ticket to win it? Or is this just really a matter of, I don't know, you tell me what it's a matter of.
Well, I guess, can we go down the lane of the business case for DEI? Certainly. Here's the thing. You have blind spots. You have underperforming cultures. If you focus in a strategic way on your culture, it will improve all of your I just read this last week. It will improve all of your metrics that you actually are saying you care about, like ROI, et cetera, 785% in 10 years. You are losing money because you're losing talent. You know this already. You feel it every day. Like, a lot of places have wars. A lot of industries are having wars on talent. They can't find talent. The talent, the diversity you're bringing in is bleeding out at some point because you don't have equity and inclusion going on in a meaningful way for them. So they're never rising up to the levels of leadership where it starts to change culture organically because the leadership team has enough representation for that to happen. So not only are you missing out and creating and have blind spots, you're losing money because you're losing talent that's diverse. You're losing diverse. You're also not innovating in the same level you could if you had a diverse team. That's just proven. Like, you will, with diverse voices in decision making, you will increase whatever metrics your team is measured on by at least 17%. So we have some stats on that. But at the end of the day, your job as an employer or a leader in a company is to provide a supportive and development ridden culture to whoever's coming into your culture, because that only benefits you. If I reach my fullest potential with you, then it benefits us both. And that's the whole point. So to me, you have a covenant with the people that you hire. You say, you come in and you do your best for us, and we will make sure you have what you need to do your best for us. And we are failing people that are from underrepresented groups, or we wouldn't be having these conversations in the first place. So that's the whole point. Like, to me, that's the whole point of your existence as a company. And so you're failing yourself and you're failing the people around you. And if that is not compelling to you, we're probably not the people you should be talking to.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like the shortfalls and the failures should be fairly tangible, and you should be able to know that they exist. That makes perfect sense to me. Another question that came in, Trisha, over the next 20, 30 years, we're expected to see a shift in demographics where non-white Hispanic citizens comprise more than 50% of the population here in the United States. Will this shift necessarily drive inclusivity? I mean, if not, how do we push for this, to be prepared and set ourselves up for success in the future?
Well, I would say now is the time to make sure you're planning for that. Here's the thing that scares me, because we've been talking about this. I've been talking about this for 20 years. We can just take women as an example. Women make up more than half the population, and women make up a tiny percentage of real juice leadership in corporate America. When I made partner, it was 11% women partners in the firm globally. Right now, I think they're at 14 or 15%. And I made partner in 2006. So it's been 15 years and we're still in the teens. So it's not going very well. Like we need to put it on overdrive. What makes me nervous is that, yes, the cry for DEI is going to get louder and louder and louder. If we continue to have people that come into our companies that are diverse and then never get beyond middle management because the inclusion and equity piece isn't solved, that's just going to create worse scenarios. Like, do we want to be the same with, let's just take the Latino community as an example. If half the people in our country are now Latino, but they're not in leadership, what does that mean for us? It doesn't look good. It looks like a big mess all over again to me. So we have a lot of work to do. I hope that answered your question. I think we have our work cut out for us over the next 20 to 30 years, and I won't be here in 30 years, hopefully. So I'm going to have to pass a lot of batons because it's going to take a while. But I think I would love for it to be a hell of a lot more intentional and comprised of a lot more understanding now that we seem to be listening more than it has ever been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think intentional is the key word there. It has to be intentional, I believe. Don't want you to ever be out of work, Trisha, but I do think
there's this thing called retirement, and it sounds pretty magical.
That's true. It does sound pretty magical. I absolutely 100% can identify. Okay, so here's a question, and I know we have many Lockheed Martin Leadership Institute students watching today, and they have been focusing on a project called Envision 2040. This project takes a look at what individuals need to do to consider preparing themselves for the future. Where do you envision the most change in terms of diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments? And how might we support this change moving forward?
Ooh, I think that one of the most amazing things about this work right now is that Gen Zers, is that who's in college now? Am I getting it right? Gen Z, or is there one after that I'm not even aware of? So Gen Z is waking everybody up right now in some of these bigger companies. No matter how they show up, they could be a white straight guy, and they are like, I don't want to work for you if you're not handling these issues, or I don't see a lot of diversity around me, or I don't see diversity in leadership. And they are really moving the ball just by having a very strong conviction around these issues. and it's taking effect. So I'm most thrilled for that. I think that they're gonna have an amazing impact on how things are done. In 20 years, I will be ready almost. I mean, I'll be retiring in 20 years. Hopefully well before that, actually. But that baton I'm perfectly comfortable with. Never before has a generation come into the workplace and said, I don't really like the way this stuff is being done. I'll take that back. Millennials changed work-life balance quite a bit. Like they were like, I don't want my entire identity to be what I do for a living. And it did change things, a lot of things. The Gen Zs are coming in and saying, this isn't okay with us. And you're actually not doing as well as a company because this is the way you're doing things. So let's do something about this. And that is huge. And they're educating those of us that were taught completely different things than they were, that were the wrong things. Like one example, I was taught to be colorblind. I was literally taught by teachers to be colorblind, to see the person and not the color. We were taught to avoid having real conversations. And Gen Zs have been taught the opposite of that, and they're changing the world already with that discourse.
Absolutely. I think there are so many opportunities to move the needle. And I love that you referenced being taught to be colorblind, because I think there's so much substance and power in celebrating what is not the same, and celebrating the difference. So thank you for mentioning that. Let's see. We have a couple questions that have come in during the webinar. And this, I think, is a really good question, because I think oftentimes when the scab has been picked and there's a great momentum for having these conversations, that sometimes once the conversation has happened and action has started, there's so much room for fatigue. Can you help us, sort of figure out how to avoid that kind of fatigue and sort of lackadaisical approach that oftentimes sort of happens after the fact?
Yeah, and I the first thing that comes to mind is a giant cliche, which is this is a marathon and not a sprint, which I hate when people say that to me. I think, we need to honor fatigue. Like we've all been through a lot the last 12 months. And we understand it with regard to that, right? Like we are not going to be on our A game all the time right now in this COVID and the massive changes that are happening and all the things that entails. We need to do the same thing with this, especially for the underrepresented people that are also so often asked to jump into the fray and handle things, educating people and talking about their own often very traumatic experiences, and many of them. So it's honoring the fatigue in a way where we let people take breathers and we don't expect them to jump in just because they're of an underrepresented group, and pace ourselves and be, intentionality helps with fatigue. So having a plan and walking the walk of that plan and allowing team members to jump on and off and take care of themselves too through that process is, to me, how you handle that. We do it for other kinds of things. There's no reason why we can't do it for this too.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so here's in a slightly different direction. I have a question that just came in. Can you please explain the importance of the parenthetical gender pronouns that we're seeing a lot more now, certainly attached to your names in virtual meetings, and how will this become relevant and or expressed as we move out of the virtual space again someday and into a more physical space with one another? Is this a conversation that needs to be had, or?
I don't, so you're asking me, what is the purpose of having gender pronouns, or how does it work in real life when we go back to being in real life with each other?
I think that's my question. How does it work, okay, and why is it important that we are including them currently? And then certainly how does that translate into a more interpersonal social world?
Okay. So I obviously, given my work, am working with all kinds of people all the time. Me including my gender pronouns, even though I'm simply a cisgendered white chick that that does this stuff, is to honor the fact that other people might have pronouns that are not obvious from the way they appear to me. And I want them to feel comfortable having those conversations with me. That is all I'm doing. I'm signaling that it's okay to be whoever you are with me, and I will honor however you show up and what you want your pronouns, what pronouns you want to be honored in our interactions with each other. Hopefully that's the way that happens when we go back to, I say real life, but this is real life, back to in-person life, live people life. And to me, that is, I guess honoring before understanding is important in this regard. So what do I mean by that? I mean, I might not fully understand. Like if someone comes and says, my pronouns are, and there's several different kinds of pronouns, I don't fully understand that. And frankly, it's not my place to ask that in a mixed setting where they might not feel comfortable telling me that. My job is to honor them and do my best to understand the context as it goes. Or if I have a close enough relationship to have that conversation by myself at some point. So my advice would be honor pronouns and the way someone wants to be, regarded and spoke to, before you fully understand, because it takes a while to understand fully, and that's okay. But honor pronouns first. It's like if someone came and said my name was Teresa, and I said no, my name is Trisha. Okay, I mean, you're not going to argue with me about calling me Trisha, right? So just honor pronouns, regardless of whether you understand or not, and then obviously do your best to understand.
Yeah, I think honoring first obviously comes before understanding. So they certainly go hand in hand, and one is important for the other. I absolutely agree. Let's see. We have a question that just came in. How have the challenges of COVID either increased or decreased awareness for the need of DEI policies and organizations? I know this has been a year of social upheaval, so I'm curious if people felt more inclined to seek assistance for DEI related initiatives, or if people felt like, okay, well, it's easier now that we're not working in person to maybe push it to the back. What are your thoughts?
Well, what's weird is my thoughts have changed over the last year. So when COVID first hit, I'm like, oh boy, we better ramp up the business strategy side of our business because no one's going to talk to us about DEI for who knows how long. I was booked on, 10 different national stages for conferences, and they all got canceled in like a week. And I was like, oh no, what are we going to do now? What people realized, and obviously George Floyd was a big part of this, was that these issues are even amplified in a remote space where we are interacting remotely. It seems like we have less cues with each other, so we don't read as well other people, but we've also gotten the opportunity to see into people's homes, and see how they live on a much more personal level, and see them struggle through figuring out how to be in COVID and have a million different things happening at once, like cats jumping on your lap and kids screaming in the background and all those things. So it gave us a really amazing opportunity to understand more deeply how the day-to-day affects people that don't look like us or have to experience that stuff the same way we do. Everyone was using, we're in the same storm, but we're in different boats. This applies to DEI too. And I think people realize as they're figuring out how to manage at some point a hybrid workplace where some are remote and some are not, culture in general is at stake and at risk. And DEI is just is even more complicated. And so I've seen people not just wake up and say, we better start doing things. I've had people think, this gets even trickier in a remote environment or a hybrid environment. And what are we going to do about that? Because we could lose the good parts of our culture in addition to not being able to amplify the, the change around DEI in our culture. So I have seen most of it as a positive thing. And I hope that continues. I hope we don't put this on a back burner for any reason, but I hope it continues to be amplified.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's see. Here's a question, and you may be able to speak to it and give us better answers than we might have imagined for ourselves. So Nancy says, I have a coworker who lives nearby me. I was surprised to see a flag flying from his flagpole that represents hate and racism to most of the rest of us. How do I handle this in the workplace, as it's really shaken my understanding of who that person is? And I understand where she's coming from, because this is a very small town, and oftentimes where we don't know that people are hanging on to those kinds of values and beliefs, and then suddenly they're heir apparent. I mean, it really does kind of shake your understanding of who you thought you knew and who you thought you were working with. Do you have any advice for that?
Ooh, this is something that employers ask me all the time, especially in the realm of politics, and what the politics and identity politics seem to be saying about who we are as people and the things we value or don't value. This is a tough one. But I would say if you feel so inclined and you feel like you're going to be okay if you have the conversation, I would have the conversation. I would say, this is what I'm assuming about you. And I'm a pretty direct, straightforward person, so keep that in mind. I'm not an introvert. This is what I'm assuming about you when I see something like that, and it really bothers me. Can you help me understand? Because I think that opens up the other person with the flag, understanding what he or she is representing by having that kind of flag. But we are always going to be disappointed by people in the workplace, whether it's that or something else. And we figure out ways to either have those conversations or limit the interaction we have to have with those people if we're not in control of what happens, right? If Nancy, to use your name, sees situations where what she's assuming shows up in the workplace, then you have a much more direct route to have something done about that, or to have another conversation. But just assuming like value systems, I would check in with that person to actually see if my assumptions are correct or not.
Absolutely. And again, that it's an uncomfortable spot sometimes, but hearkening back to what you said earlier about we only get to be uncomfortable for a short period of time. It sort of takes making oneself uncomfortable to maybe understand a little bit more. And then one last question here, unless something else comes in the meantime. Can you talk a little bit more about intentionality, and why is it important to be intentional, especially when there are people who think that not seeing color is a good way to achieve diversity in an organization?
Well, I guess the short answer is you're missing so much if you're not intentional. A lot of the cultures of the places we're working with in the firm have never been created intentionally. That means that the good things about your culture are just happened organically, based on the people you put together, or the bad things about your culture happen that way. Culture is implicit. Mm-hmm. You can't fully know the impact of the culture you organically created without finding out. You don't know yourself. So when leaders tell me, well, this is what our culture is, we're very family, we're like a big family. And well, some people don't think that being like a big family is a good thing. Like there's often a lot of dysfunction in a family. You're probably excluding without realizing it. There's probably inequities happening, So intentionality means I have a hell of a lot more clarity around what I'm actually dealing with, so I can decide I want it to be a different way. Like I am all for designing designing your own, how your relationships are going to go, like designing what you want your marriage to look like, designing what your relationship with your kids is going to look like. Why do we assume that that shouldn't be the case when it comes to putting a bunch of us together in one place toward a common theme or goal or vision? Like, that seems kind of ridiculous to me. So intentional cultures always win over unintentional ones. And that's true no matter, intentional, anything often wins over unintentional ones. So intentionality means we're going to hold ourselves accountable to what we decided to design. And that's to me huge.
Absolutely. That was such a perfect way to put it. I couldn't agree with you more. Okay, so here's one last question that's just come in. And, I think police violence, racism always has been a problem. It's been a problem for a very long time, at least through the lens that I view the world. But why do you think it took the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the countless of folks murdered who didn't need to be killed or murdered, for people to sort of wake up again this time to the systemic racism here in America? What is this? Is it a cycle? Can you help us with that? Why do we need something this big?
Well, that is a gigantic question that I'm not sure I can answer eloquently. I will give it my best shot. Because we've lost dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of African Americans to police violence and other kinds of violence that is race-based and systemic systems of racism for 400 years. And honestly, the only thing I can point to, I think that if these things had not been, if George Floyd had not been taped, and I'm using a term that dates myself, if that whole watching him get murdered on tape for 8 long minutes had not happened, I'm not sure that we'd be here right now. There is an immediacy and an urgency to always seeing video of things actually happening that seems to be changing a lot of things, and how we think about them, how we bring them into our homes and have to deal with them because they're in our face and we're seeing them live, all that stuff that has an immediacy to it and an emotionally compelling thing to it that we've never had before. So I would have to point to that. I think the ways in which we dismiss racism and rationalize ourselves out of it can't be done when it's in our face like that in any other time in history. Like, I just don't think, I think if we had seen Emmett Till be lynched, we might not be here today. Like, we might be in a different place. And that's sad and awful, but that's the only thing I can point to that says we can't justify or rationalize our way out of this anymore.
So do you think that sort of this ever increasing presence of a camera lens being everywhere will ultimately help create a culture of accountability for our actions, particularly as it relates to police violence, for that matter? Do you think that will lend itself to some sort of greater understanding, acceptance, accountability, inclusivity, anything of that nature?
I certainly hope so, but I remember there are still people that think that there's a rationalization, and that is just indicative that we have a lot of work to do. It has to go beyond the video to having real conversations with people and understanding experiences we could never understand because of our privilege. And until we get to that point, so if the video helps us get to that point, then it's got some level of worth. But if we don't get past that, then it's simply voyeuristic and not very helpful.
Absolutely.
So I hope that that's where we're headed.
So I think the bottom line, what I'm taking away here, is that it really sort of boils down to having a conversation, really listening talking, understanding. I mean, that's in the workplace, that's in your neighborhood, that's at the grocery store for, that matter. So, I think the takeaways here today are really just opening your minds to having uncomfortable conversations, as the case may be, and really seeking to hear rather than talk at somebody with your own belief system.
And it's very hard to have our assumptions disrupted. We find safety in assumptions. That goes right back to bias again. But you have to walk into these conversations knowing your assumptions are going to be destroyed and that you're going to have to create a new understanding. If you don't, then you're just traumatizing the person telling the stories to you. So don't do that. Show up assuming nothing and allow what happens to happen.
And, I think, again, we can go back to what you said about don't go to lunch with the same people every day. I think there's so much value in finding what does not look like you in other people, what does not sound like you. I think you're so right. And giving yourself the opportunity to step outside the box you've drawn for yourself is really where all of this begins. Thank you so much. Mary Ellen, do you have anything to add before we sign off for the day?
Yes, I want to add to these uncomfortable conversations. They're important. I've been having them, and I was afraid to have them at first. I was very afraid because I was afraid I was going to hurt someone in inadvertently saying the wrong thing, bringing a word up that I thought meant something that they think meant something else. And what I have found is that being honest and saying to them, I'm going to make mistakes, but I still want to have this conversation. And I hope you help me to see aspects that I don't see by myself. My biases block me. And I have found that really gives the freedom to have the conversations, and mistakes are made on both sides, right? And we educate each other as we go through, and it's all part of being that, ally and stepping up and saying, I want to be part of this fight too, because we can't expect the underrepresented minorities to solve this by themselves. We just can't. And so we have to be a part of the solution.
Absolutely. I think allowing yourself to be a little bit vulnerable to have the difficult conversations is scratching the surface where it needs to be scratched. Absolutely. Well, thank you to you both so very much. This has been such an important conversation to have and to talk about. And that is all the time we have for today. As a reminder, a recording of this very, very valuable presentation will be available on our website later today. Thank you so much to Trisha Daho and Mary Ellen Giffords for leading us today in this webinar. A special thanks to the College of Engineering and Computing's Women's Advisory Council for their collaboration today. Please check out our other webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. And we thank you for joining us. Love and honor to you all. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.